So,
All
so
right.
intrusive R. Tell me about intrusive R. Tell us maybe how it's related to linking words in connected speech, if there are any accents that don't do it or do it in your
Hmm.
field of expertise, which is a lot of accents, but I'm particularly thinking of accents in and around the UK.
Right. What's interesting to me about intrusive R is that it's basically an R sound that pops up, even though it's not invited to in the writing. Right. So
Mm.
what we need to do is distinguish intrusive R from linking R.
Mm, mm-hmm,
Right.
mm-hmm.
Because they're two different things. Right. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start with linking R,
Please, please.
because with linking R, what that is, this is a phenomenon that exists in accents that are non-rhotic. So accents of the English language where the R sound is not pronounced unless it is followed immediately by a vowel sound. So we're talking about accents like uh, most English accents in England, and also accents in Australia, almost all the accents of New Zealand, and most accents of South Africa, and also a few accents in North America as well, mostly on the east coast of the United States. So in those accents, in those non-rhotic accents, what happens is, like I said, the R isn't pronounced if it comes after a vowel, and then what comes after it is nothing,
Mm-hmm,
like a pause, or if a consonant comes after it.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So, just like in my accent, I said after it. So there's an
mm-hmm,
example just
mm-hmm,
there
mm-hmm,
of a linking R, because
mm-hmm,
usually I would say after
mm-hmm,
and then it. But if
mm-hmm,
I put those two words together, we get the linking R, which is after it.
mm-hmm,
Okay. So that's a linking R.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay.
So we can say that in American English, for example, I'm going to pronounce that R when I'm linking, and you guys, well, other accents are too, but only if there's a vowel after it.
Exactly. That's
Mm-hmm.
right. So in a general American accent, a so-called general American
Mm-hmm.
accent, you would pronounce that R all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always there. But that's right. If it's an accent where the R is only pronounced when it's followed immediately by a vowel sound, then it would just pop up just for that moment
Mm-hmm.
when it's got a word, the next word starts with a vowel sound. It appears just before a word
Mm-hmm.
that starts with a vowel sound.
And it seems to me like this is the R that is always invited to the party, and it never comes. In those other
Yeah.
accents, it never comes to the party. You always invite them, but they never come. And then it seems to me like the intrusive R is the guy you don't invite to the party, but he always shows up. Is that kind of
Right.
how you think of it?
That's a really great explanation. Yes. That's right. So where a linking R is basically pretty much silent in most cases, unless it feels the need to come along and link to the vowel, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I'm going to show up just for a split second
Mm-hmm.
because I can't have a sound followed by a sound. You can't have right?
Mm-hmm.
Although there is an alternative,
Yeah.
right? For many people, they will use a glottal stop instead. So instead of
Mm-hmm.
saying after it, where you have the linking R, you might have after it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, for example, in South Africa, many South African accents don't have linking R.
Mm-hmm.
They don't use it, and instead they'll employ a glottal stop instead and say after it. So yeah, but that's a great that's a very funny analogy you have, where it's somebody who's not invited to the party but just shows up anyway. And so now we're talking about intrusive R, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is a great
Mm-hmm.
word because it's the intruder, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
They weren't asked to come along.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They weren't invited. So so this one is where you don't have a letter R there at all. And this is something that has always surprised a lot of North Americans, because I live in Toronto, and I've taught English for a long time. And so many of my fellow teachers have said to me, I just taught something about intrusive R from this book that is obviously from the UK, and it said that you pronounce it like law and order instead of law and order. It's law and order, and I'm like, yeah. And they just looked at me like, this cannot be true. Like, what is going on here?
You're like, yes, and they're like, no,
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
kidding me. Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, we've been doing it for ages, but
Yeah.
or for ages. Here goes linking
There's
on.
your linking, yeah.
Yes.
And that's okay, because
and
that R is supposed to be there, so I don't have any trouble with that. But I can see how the other
Right.
person was like, wait a minute, why are you putting an R in here? There was no R on that word to begin with. So what's behind that then? If in your
Right.
speculation, how did that come about, if you have any thoughts?
Okay, so I think what, well, first of all, I'll just explain that just very quickly for anybody who didn't catch that, you know, this is an R sound that turns up even though it's not represented in the writing. And so it's a phenomenon whereby you have an R sound that is inserted into the end of a word, or actually between words, which would be a word that ends in a vowel sound, right? Ends in a vowel sound. Usually that would be either the central vowel, like or schwa, or it ends in a back vowel, like ah or or, right? So so a word that ends in a back vowel, and then the next word starts with a vowel sound. So this is it's kind of like it's an overgeneralized reinterpretation, if you like, of linking R. Because we've always done this linking R ever since we dropped the whole, okay, you don't need to pronounce the R if it's not followed by a vowel, right? Which most of you guys in North America didn't get that memo. And for us, it was like, okay, this is much easier. You know, this is one less phoneme we need to pronounce. And so so we still had the linking R, but this is one where an R sound pops up to link between otherwise really awkward sounds that would be next to each other.
Combinations that might otherwise be more difficult, right? So that R it can be quite helpful. So I can see why, number one, it was kept, right? You've got a vowel and then a word that ends in a vowel and R, and then the next word begins with a vowel. Hey, that's helpful, right? I can link that through. I don't have to glide through 2 to 4 vowels. I don't have to end up doing that, because the R can be kind of like a spacer, right? It can help me out with that. So it makes sense how, hey, this R is pretty handy. I think we'll stick it in here too, right? To make those vowel gliding things easier. Is that what you're going for?
So for example, because otherwise you're going from, for example, law, and then the next word, and, law and or, law and order. And another one would be, I don't know, let's say we're talking about 2 people. One's called Amelia and the other one's called Tom or whatever. So they'd say Amelia and Tom, right? Instead of Amelia and Tom, right? Because you can't have and it doesn't fit the tactics of English. So,
and God forbid you're not reducing that and to at least in American English, right? We're going to be like and. So law, law, and. Imagine you're not even reducing that. That's a far distance to go. And wouldn't it just be easier to stick something in there and give it a little cushion?
Right, exactly. So, I mean, but, you know, this is only something that tends to happen in non-rhotic accents, you know, and I know there's another thing as well, that is called, I think it's called over-rhoticization.
Tell me about that.
Hyper-rhoticization.
Oh.
So what that is when somebody puts in a letter R at the end of a word that doesn't actually have an R at the end. So an example of this you could find in Mr. Fauci's accent. So Fauci is from New York. He's an older speaker from somewhere in New York State, from the city of New York, which is traditionally a non-rhotic accent. And so if you listen to some of the words he says, he'll put an R sound where there isn't one. So because in his own accent, there wouldn't normally be a letter R. It's a non-rhotic accent, but then sometimes he hyper-rhoticizes or puts an R in where there isn't one as a kind of correction.
And regardless of if there's a vowel in the next word, correct? So that could be a word that ends in a vowel, and then let's say a period or a comma or some kind of pause, and
or
there's
as
no
he
reason
might
to
say,
link it.
a comma.
Exactly. And he wouldn't say the word or after it. He wouldn't be using that intrusive R in a way to link them, even though there's no R. He would do that even if there is no need, let's say, as a linking tool, correct?
Some people, might do that. Yeah.
I have a question for you going back to law and order. So we said, okay, especially if you're starting with a back vowel, right? Then you might be going to a center vowel or a front vowel. Maybe there isn't evidence of this, but do you feel like an intrusive R might be more necessary if you're going from back all the way to front? Or do you find it's maybe more common from back to center? Do you have any thoughts about that? Or going front to center, front to back?
I think really the way it works is that it just tends to be if the last vowel is a back vowel or a center vowel. And then it doesn't matter what the vowel sound is that the next word starts with.
Okay.
It just has to be either the schwa sound that it ends with, like comma, or it can be it would tend to be a back sound like or ah, and that's when it would pop up. It doesn't matter if it's exactly, because if it's the vowel E, the fleece vowel, then it doesn't really do anything. So if I said me and you, or me and you, or me or you, then we would have that glide, the y glide, the yard would appear instead. Right?
That was what I was wondering. I was wondering if, like, let's say direction mattered if I was going back to front or front to back, and it seems like it does, right? So it seems like if I'm ending a word with a front vowel, I'm probably not going to get an intrusive R. Would that summarize it, do you think?
Yeah, exactly,
Excellent. And what other things do you find interesting about either intrusive R or linking R, or maybe R's in general, in the varying accents?
Yeah, I think it's amazing that you can see how there's this split between accents that are rhotic and non-rhotic, and the line is not as simple as just drawing it through the Atlantic, because like I said earlier, a lot of East Coast accents, especially for older speakers, those are non-rhotic. And so the line you could draw between them sort of goes down between Northeast the United States and Canada, and then it goes down sort of the Appalachians, and then sort of across over to Texas. And those regions where they're non-rhotic, those regions are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. So people are tending to go towards accents where they're just pronouncing the R. The R is in North America, that is, those R pronouncing accents have become more prestigious, whereas it's the opposite. It's the opposite way in England. I won't say the UK so much, but throughout England, the R pronouncing regions, at one time, like 100 years ago, those were, as far, they weren't that far west of the West Midlands and London. And it was most of the west of England that pronounced their R's, and a lot of places in the south of England. But now, and there was a fairly large area around Lancashire. But nowadays, the only places that pronounce their R's are mostly traditional speakers down in the southwest around Bristol, really far away from Birmingham and London, and a tiny area in just part of Lancashire. And so what that says is that the R pronouncing areas are they're less prestigious, because in RP, of course, that is non-rhotic. You don't pronounce your R. So it's like two opposite directions that, either side of the channel that is happening. So
and that gulf is widening. It sounds like not only is it a dividing thing, but that the feelings are maybe getting stronger as time goes on. In the North American side, you're on the R team, and on the European side, you're more on the non-rhotic team, and you're very strongly supporting that team, and it's more aspirational than to either do or not do that thing. What about in other areas, like you mentioned in Australia, New Zealand, any of those other places, perhaps India? I don't know anything about other accents and how they feel about that rhoticity, if they're feeling more aspirational or less aspirational.
Yeah. When we're talking about Australia, New Zealand, and Anglo South Africa, because the people that went out there, or not all of the people, but the majority of people, I guess, or the ones who went out there to colonize those parts of the world, their descendants, because it's really the most important thing, aren't the people that went out there so much, but their descendants, their kids that got together, and what kind of mishmash came out of that. They tended to all be non-rhotic, almost all, because there is a small area in part of the South Island of New Zealand where it is unusually rhotic. So, but the vast majority of people, they're non-rhotic. So, because most of the populations that went out there were mainly from the southeast of England, which was, by the time that they were going out there in the late 1700s, early 1800s, were already majorly non-rhotic anyway. So
why would they pick it up? Yeah, it doesn't make any sense that they would just spontaneously say, "Oh, well, there's an R here. Let's start talking about these R's." Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about the UK, we're only talking about England, where the non-rhotic accents are the majority ones, the ones that are kind of crowding out the R pronouncing ones, because north of the border in Scotland, the majority of people are rhotic, the majority. But there seems to be a slight trend in the younger speakers to become less rhotic, but this might be considered like a separate thing. I don't think they're being influenced by RP in this case. And it may be a short-lived, so it's hard. It's one to watch.
Yes, wait and see.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens to R's in the future. Yes. We'll keep an eye on those R's. Yes.
But the truth is that at one time, like if you go back to Shakespeare's time, everybody pretty much pronounced their R's. So, non-rhotic accents are, on the greater scheme of things, they're the new kids on the block. And so I could just say that people in North America are just old-fashioned.
Happens with so many things, right? When you get this like linguistic kind of isolation, or especially geographic, you get this isolation, you're kind of stuck in time in that way. And there's certain things there's features that persist simply because you just don't have contact with that anymore, and there's no reason for you to change otherwise.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm sure there's probably a name for this, some kind of scientific name, but it's a phenomenon where you have colonizers, and the ones that go out there and live in those colonies tend to keep the old-fashioned ways, and back in the motherland, in the hub, things change at a faster pace. So this is pretty much what's happened linguistically in the English-speaking world, where the original place for English kind of percolated, if you like, England. Things have moved on a lot faster, and there are lots more different accents there.
Yeah, you see this similar phenomenon with colonizing countries that colonized other places in the past, and you can see that even though they spoke the same language, there's a vast difference. There's that linguistic drift, and I feel like what we're describing now is almost like an anti-linguistic drift or a consequence of that. I'm sure there's got to be a word there, but I don't know it right now.
Well, I mean, that's the other thing to do with empire in a way is that, the attitude that, there's a right way and a wrong way to do things. That the way of the empire, the central unit is this is how people should sound, right? This is how people should behave. And which is kind of sad in a way because it sort of like kills off the variety of accents and cultures. And so this is something that's very strong in the United States, especially where people are tending towards, oh, I need to sound general American, or I need to sound like I don't have an accent. That's another one.
Because a lot of people don't have an accent. It's this power, it's this prestige, it's control sometimes, and I think sometimes we think that's a thing of the past, but we're all still we're not immune to the idea of like, I think this is better, so I want that thing, right? I have this prejudice, I have this bias, and I want to make some changes because, of course, why wouldn't I want to be part of the ruling class, or get that better job or something like that? It seems to be human nature, but sometimes taken at an extreme.
They're also precious from accent bias as well, right? So wherever you live, whatever language you speak, there's always going to be, positive and negative bias to different parts, different ways of speaking.
Because we're always comparing ourselves to those around us, and we usually speak like those in our closest circle, but we're still constantly often comparing ourselves. Yeah. So that leads me to a question then. What do you think is driving this change that we mentioned about this kind of gulf between, let's say, rhoticity getting stronger or more desirable in North America versus non-rhoticity becoming more of an aspirational thing? What do you think is causing that?
That really, I think, is down to what is considered a prestige and what is, because the prestige ideas, the concepts of what is prestigious, what is, what some people might call correct, in those certain places those are very different, right? So, and of course, attached to this also is the concept of identity. So if, identity is important for all of us. And so for me, my identity is kind of split, not split personality as they used to call it, but in terms of, I grew up in England and moved out to Canada 20 years ago. So I'm surrounded by people, or I should say my wife and I are surrounded by people, including our children, who speak with Canadian accents. All our children speak with a rhotic Torontonian accent, right? So that is something that affects you and your accent, and different people's accents change at different rates, right? So I sound more Canadian than my wife does, but we left England at exactly the same time. So and so that is one to do with identity, right? So that's why my accent is so inconsistent and all over the place. Sometimes it's rhotic and sometimes it isn't. It's fairly random. And but when you're living in a speech community, then obviously your identity is pretty much tied to where you are and how you see yourself. And so that's why they're different. So then, of course, if you start sounding more like a group that you're not a part of, then you're considered an outsider. So or there's some strange reason why are you affecting an accent that is not us? So.
And are you affecting it, or are you being affected, essentially, right? Maybe you are going out with your Canadian friends who you've known these 20 years, and maybe if you were to clock it, maybe more R's would slip out on that day, right? Versus where you were talking to, I don't know, family on a Skype back home, you could probably clock the same words, but very few R's that might slip out, right?
Exactly.
That's my guess. Yeah. So in grouping and out grouping, that's a big function of language, is to be a part of the group or say, not for me, you know. And yeah, it makes sense. And I'm sure a lot of people have, let's say, a similar split in, maybe not even a split in identity, but allegiance perhaps, and there might be some guilt there. You get people who move from one place to another, and then also they have children, and they're thinking, you know, do I preserve this? Do I adopt new ways? What's a good balance? How do I feel about it? How is it seen? It's just a really complex issue.
Yes. And I might add that it's never a good idea to try and preserve your children in terms of, like, you know, telling them this is the right way to say things or this is the right way to pronounce them, because you're gonna fail. Because kids don't grow up sounding, none of us grow up sounding like our parents. The only reason that we would do that is if we're in the same place, but then of course accents change over time. So yeah, there's always going to be that difference generation wise anyway, whether you're staying in the same place or not. But yeah,
and good, that's healthy. That's like good that things do not stand still, that you know, time is not frozen. I feel like the only time that might happen is in some very undesirable circumstance, right? Some kind of abusive relationship where, you know, the child was kept so isolated that they didn't have the input of other people, and that's not something anybody wants.
Well, I think they did that once, didn't they? Where I think there was something like back in, I don't know, was it the 1400s? They did an experiment, because at the time, I mean, we're talking like hundreds of years ago, there was a belief that the original language was Hebrew. They had this idea that everybody originally spoke Hebrew, and then all other languages kind of developed out of that. I mean, you know, we're talking about a time when, you know, every single aspect of your life was, you know,
religiously
basically
based, and all your theories have to, all the theories have to come from there, make sense from there.
Yeah. So so what they did, allegedly, I mean, I don't know, there's no actual, I mean, somebody wrote about it, I don't know how true it is or how apocryphal, but apparently they did have this experiment where they isolated the child to see if, you know, so that nobody spoke to them and nobody communicated with them, which sounds like a really bad idea.
Yeah, and it's completely unallowable today. Yes.
Yeah, complete, absolutely child abuse. But the idea was to see if they ended up speaking Hebrew. You know, it just seems so ridiculous.
It's just gonna come out, right?
Yeah,
that's what happens. It just, you're spontaneously preset. Your default is Hebrew, and so if we just leave you alone, you'll definitely speak Hebrew. Wow, unthinkable. The unthinkable experiments, right? Wow, so scary how those things come about. And speaking of religion, have you ever read this book called Cultish by Amanda Montell?
I don't think I have.
Oh, it's great. You should read it. It's very much about how language is a tool of power to keep control over people, and especially you can picture in religious cults, right? How that power is necessary. And so when you mentioned that earlier, I thought, oh yeah, I bet I could see in that situation where there's in grouping and out grouping, right? We say this, so you need to speak like this, and that could very much include your actual pronunciation, not just the words you choose or the tone you use with members of your group, but also like which sounds you make, because that's a very small isolated group, and it's trying to be isolating on purpose.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure you'll also have heard of certain twins that in many cases create their own language between them,
twin languages,
so that they can communicate just between themselves. I mean, it's not like they sit down and, you know, with a book and say, okay, well, this word means that, and that one means this, but they actually naturally grow up together speaking a language that excludes all others outside of just the two of them, which is another really
Exactly.
interesting
They
concept.
don't set out to do that. They don't say, okay, today's the day we make our twin dictionary, but it just develops like that. And you can widen that, I think, too, to, you know, your best friends, to even as you're older, like the people that you spend the most time with. And I feel like it's natural for us to say, hey, this is us, and those other
Mhm.
guys can do whatever they want, but this is what we're going to do. I don't even know what they're doing over there, but this is what we're doing, and this is part of our identity. So when you move from one group to the other one, I can see how it's very shocking, you know, to your identity, and you might not know what to do with that because there's no handbook, you know, there's no rule book
and,
about
and
that.
and that's also known as slang as well, because a lot of people often say that, well, slang are these informal words, you know, but I'm sorry, if they're in the dictionary, they're not slang anymore, they're
Mm-hmm.
informal,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
slang is that kind of language that is used, or the usage of words that is only used within a closed group and
Yep.
are more markers of identity of being a part of that group, as you know, excluding all the others outside of the group. And
By the time it's in the dictionary, you're too late, right? If I have to,
yeah,
because I feel like an old lady sometimes, and I don't know what the kids are saying these days, and I'll hear something, and I'll be like, maybe I'll look that up, and I look it up, and it's there, and just the fact that it's there makes me feel old, right? If something's not
right.
there, then I can ask, right? And I still don't feel great about that. But if it's in the dictionary, I'm too late. I'm way too late to the party, you know.
Yeah, unless it's Urban Dictionary, but then yeah, it's a rabbit hole you might not want to go down.
Exactly. Yeah. Speaking of lack of moderation, right? Yeah. Yeah. It's horrible. But on the other hand, I often get answers I'm looking for pretty quickly, or I get an idea at least. Yeah. It can be helpful in its own way. It has a place in the world, I think. And besides that, I know we're straying very far from the topic, but is there anything else that you want to add about rhotic versus non-rhotic, and maybe how you have changed over time, or things that you've just noticed and felt and had reactions about, because we're not immune to those things, as we say.
Yeah, I mean, if I can speak from a personal point of view, in that my accent has changed several times throughout my long life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I grew up in Birmingham, which is a non-rhotic accent, and then I moved to the southeast of England, which again is all non-rhotic. But then I moved to Bristol, and I lived there for about 6 years. So then my accent became slightly more rhotic, especially when I was talking to people from Bristol, and that again is a natural thing, that you tend to start to sound like the people that you like and the people
Mm-hmm.
that you hang out with. So I started to sometimes pronounce my R's at times, and
Mm.
then I moved out from Bristol and then back to London, and those R's disappeared very quickly. And you know, I moved out to uh, Canada, and those R's slip in quite a lot because you know,
Mm.
again, I'm surrounded by a
Mm-hmm.
rhotic accent. So I don't really feel anything about pronouncing them, but
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you that, and this is true for a lot of people that are expats that have moved to a different speech community, especially overseas. When you do hear yourself back in a recording, as I might do if I watch this,
Yeah.
then sometimes you feel a little bit. I know this is really seems really weird, but sometimes you feel a bit disappointed in yourself,
Oh.
in that you kind of let yourself sort of slip in a way, or that you sound fake. So
Uh-huh.
this, yeah, it's kind of, it's a weird phenomenon that people.
Mm-hmm.
I read a paper on it, and a lot of
Yeah.
other people were saying
Yeah.
the same things. They
Mm-hmm.
felt that they were being fake, even though they weren't trying to be. And
Mm.
I think it's just a part of not realizing that this is something that has happened to your accent naturally,
Mm-hmm.
and that you haven't caused it to happen, but it's
Yeah.
something that you know, things you've picked up,
Mm-hmm.
and it's more likely to happen to people who are a bit more um, speech empathetic, right?
Ah,
So they're
yes,
more
yes.
likely to copy other people,
Mm-hmm.
how not mimicking them in a mocking way,
No,
but
but
to sometimes match the same kind of speech patterns as the person
mm-hmm.
they're talking to. So there are a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people like that too.
Mm. And that's interesting to me too, because we hear our voices inside of our own heads bouncing around in our skulls so often, but most people don't hear recordings of themselves. And particularly, they don't have a before and after recording. So they're really only aware of how they sound inside their heads and how other people might respond or treat them or comment on them too. And so it's funny to me that you said that you had that feeling, because I was actually going to ask you if when you moved to Canada and you had kids and maybe your kids' friends, they came over, did they give you compliments on the other side of the spectrum? Did they say, "Oh, I love your accent," and what did you say to that if that ever happened?
I don't think. Well, I guess Toronto is a little bit different from many other places in Canada and throughout North America. I think it probably would be on the same sort of level as other big cities like Chicago, New York, or whatever, where it's unlikely that you would get somebody say something like, "Oh, I love your accent," or "Oh, what an interesting accent." Like, because in big cities, people just, they hear different accents all the time, and it's not a big deal, right? So, but if you go to a place where, you know, smaller populations, then you're probably going to get that. It's like, "Oh, you have an accent." I remember going to a small town in Ontario once, and this woman saying, "Oh, you have an accent," and I said, "Well, yeah, so do you." Just like, "Oh, no, I don't have an accent. I haven't moved out of Aurora since I was 20. I'm like, yeah, you've got an accent."
And yet you speak, and your mouth is open, and you're making noises, and so you have an accent because everybody has an accent. Yes, and so yeah, I think that's a really good story, because I was forgetting that Toronto is so cosmopolitan, so maybe you wouldn't get those comments, right? But if you moved to a small place, probably you would get those comments. And how do you deal with those? Sometimes I have kind of mixed feelings, right? When somebody thinks they're giving you some kind of compliment, then and you're thinking, "Well, it's not really a compliment, but you don't know that, and I don't want to insult your
Yes,
intelligence."
exactly. And I have to say, I have to admit, I've been guilty of doing the same thing, because, you know, as an accent coach, I, you know, and just like you as well, probably have done this, where you've been thinking, "That's a really interesting accent," and you're thinking, "I want to know where you're from," or it might be a challenge for yourself where you're thinking, I'm going to see if I can work out where you're from and then guess it and see if I'm right. For me, it's like a challenge, but I've had to really tone that down, because when I first moved out here, and, you know, in Toronto, there's people from so many different parts of the world and so many different accents, really interesting ones. And at first I used to say, "Oh, so where are you from?" And I would sometimes get some strange looks, like they'd look at me like, "What's your game here?" And at first I didn't realize, I don't know, maybe it's part of being neurodiverse, I don't know, but I didn't realize at first, like, why they were so put out by me asking this question. And then after a while, I realized that that question can also be intended by some people as a statement, which is like, "Oh, you're not one of us. So who are your people?" And I didn't realize it for quite a while, until, you know, the penny dropped, you know, and it clicked, and it's like, uh-oh, it sounds like I'm exercising a privilege, which is like, "You're not one of us," right?
Whoever that might be.
You're not, you don't have the privilege of having grown up speaking English as a first language. And so, you know, you have an exotic sound.
Right.
And so,
And I'm not, maybe not even judging you, but I'm studying you, and therefore, you know, I'm kind of, as the anthropologist, I'm studying you, and therefore that makes me more important. You know, I'm more intelligent, and it has a superiority aspect to it. Sometimes you're not just saying, "Where are you from?" You're saying, "What are you doing here? What do you think you're doing here?"
Yeah, and so, like, now I've come to understand that when, you know, certain people have probably been asked that question more often than I have. And coming from a degree of privilege, where I'm a white cis male, middle class, in a place where, you know, we're kind of a majority, if somebody asks me, "Oh, where's your accent from?" I don't think, okay, they're telling me that I'm an outsider. I mean, I
Mm.
know I'm not an outsider. Like, this
Mm-hmm.
is my home now.
Mm.
And sure, I still sound a bit different, and I'm okay with that. But imagine if you're somebody that's been discriminated against for a
Yeah.
long time,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
then, including their accent as a part of that. And
Yeah.
then that question can be part of a statement that they're tired of hearing. So
Yeah. It can
I
be very
try to,
triggering too, right? It can be something that like you have some maybe even trauma associated with, like that whatever your experiences were, we carry them with us, and other people don't know that, and it could just be somebody wants to make friends and they're curious about where you're from, right? Maybe they notice something or maybe not, and maybe they just want to, get to know you a little bit better. So you can get both, but you never know, right? When you just never know,
yeah,
and maybe because of your experience you always expect the worst, and that's sad. But I think that happens a
yeah,
lot. To me, it happens because here I am, like cis white girl living in Mexico, and in Spanish, I can't get through the day without somebody asking me where I'm from, and I don't necessarily take offense. I know that they're curious, but also after I tell them how long I've been here about 6 years, then they stop the conversation because it's I don't know why. It's almost like they want me to have just arrived. They want me to be a novelty. But once I tell them, hey, I live here too, just like you, they often just stop the line of questioning, right?
right.
Yeah, and to me that signals something as well. And speaking of speaking of all the different, let's say all the different encounters that we have, I hear you have a course that's coming up, and could you tell us a little bit about that, because I find it very interesting what you're offering.
Yeah, sure. So I'm offering a course which it's called 5FF, and that stands for 5 Fridays to Fluency.
Ah.
What that means is each one of them is about a particular accent. So it's designed for mainly actors
Mm-hmm.
who want to sound like, they want to improve a particular accent
Mm-hmm.
for their
Mm-hmm.
work.
Mm-hmm.
And so this first one is for the Australian accent, or I should say accents, because there are some slight
Mm-hmm. For sure,
variations in
for
different
sure.
parts of Australia.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's called 5 Fridays to Fluency. So it's a couple of hours every Friday, and we do a deep dive. It's like a 2 hour class.
You can add an
Anyone
F
who
to that. Five fabulous or fantastic.
Exactly. I could put extra X in there, but that would be swearing. If anybody's interested, like if there are any actors out there that are interested in brushing up on their Australian, you can just get more information at talklikethat.com/5FF. And that's
Perfect.
lowercase
Yeah.
f's.
And we'll add that link to the show notes. Would that be open to voiceover artists as well, or is it more
Oh
appropriate for
yeah.
actors
Well,
on stage and screen?
voiceover artists are actors too. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of my clients are voiceover artists. Some are stage actors, some are
Mm-hmm.
film actors and TV, and a lot of them are voiceover artists.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's open to pretty much any actors, and it's not just for actors who speak English as their first language, because as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter what your first language is, as long as
Mm-hmm.
you can speak English fluently.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody is moving to a different accent, whether their first accent's a native one or not. So,
Mm-hmm.
but it is designed for actors who are committed to learning the process of
Yeah.
acquiring a different accent for their work.
Mm-hmm. And those skills are going to be transferable. And you said the first one, so I'm guessing that you're going to have multiple courses for different accents.
Yes. So this first one is for Australian. The second one, I guess in 6 weeks' time, will be French. So we're going to do
Mm.
a French accent. When I say that, I mean different people from France have slightly different accents, because there are so many
Mm-hmm.
different features that
Mm-hmm.
the French accent could be. So yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
we'll be looking at French, and then I haven't decided what's coming after that yet. It's gonna be fun.
Excellent. Very good. And I can't remember where we met. I think we met on Instagram, but we've also seen each other a few times on Clubhouse. Are you still doing Clubhouse?
Yeah, I still pop in there occasionally. Accent Analysts Anomalous.
Ah,
Yeah.
Yes, I knew it was something fabulous like that. You always have the best names for things. And I love also your social media on Instagram. I just think you have the best reels of anybody. I just love your creativity. I love
Oh,
your, I
thank
don't know,
you.
yeah, I love your
I
your
appreciate that.
view on things. Yeah, I really think it's great. And I love talking to you every time we get a chance, and I hope we can do it again soon.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah.
Excellent.
It's always interesting. We always go to interesting places and end up talking about something I had no idea I was going to talk
Yes,
about. So
meandering down and finding our way
yeah,
back. Yeah, that's why I like that. I like talking to people who enjoy that style of conversation too. So we'll have to plan again soon, another time to talk. And thanks so much for joining me today.
yeah, no worries.
All right, catch you
Okay,
soon.
thanks a lot,
Bye,
Bianca.
Mark.
Speak to
See
you
you
soon.
soon.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.